particular some of the problems that I think we need to honestly assess and address in order to further the cause of justice. So my three themes that I'm going to address are: first, the politics of enforcement; second, the politics of peace; and third, the politics of monopolizing global justice. The politics of enforcement. The ICC, like any international mechanism intended to promote human rights, faces the impossible task of acting morally in a political world rent by power inequalities, domination, and violence. Because the ICC depends upon coercion to carry out its investigations and prosecutions, but lacks its own independent enforcement capacity, in its quest for efficacy, the ICC must often accommodate itself to political power instead of challenging political power. Now, this accommodation can occur globally and locally. On the global level, for example, the ICC's decision thus far to prosecute only Africans, rather than being a neo-colonialist conspiracy, I think derives from international power relations. Relations that make Africa the only region weak enough so that international intervention can take place here without accountability, and also unimportant enough so that the West will allow the ICC to act as its subcontractor, as a substitute for more direct forms of intervention. Furthermore, I think the way that the ICC has intervened within Africa has also been driven in large part by political power. For one thing, we have seen the ICC accommodate itself to US power. Ironically, it was precisely because of the Bush administration's hostility to the ICC that the court responded by aligning itself with US interests. That is, I think the ICC realized that alienating the US could easily spell disaster for the court. So the ICC appears to have decided that its best path is to avoid challenging the US or its allies, and to welcome any form of US cooperation. As a result, we have seen cases where the ICC prosecutes US enemies in Africa, and at the same time ignores crimes committed by US allies. The ICC's accommodation to US interests stands to increase further as the court tries to convince the US to lead the way in enforcing arrest warrants. In June of last year, Chief Prosecutor Moreno Ocampo called for US-led, quote, coalitions of the willing to enforce arrest warrants, celebrating what he called the rare and expensive capabilities of US special forces. Earlier this year, the prosecutor's special advisor declared that the ICC has, quote, a shopping list of requests ready of requests for assistance from the US government, because it is up to the US to, quote, lead on one particular issue, the arrest of sought war criminals. The ICC's appeals for US military support are a response to an apparent reassessment of US-ICC relations undertaken by the Obama administration, which has declared interest in working more closely with the ICC, not with the intent of becoming a party to the Rome Statute, but rather to help execute certain arrest warrants. As Ambassador Rapp made clear yesterday, the US might cooperate, but only on its own terms. Now, I think the consequences for peace and justice could be disastrous if the ICC comes to rely on the military capacity of the US, which of course has its own economic and political interests in Africa, in particular when the US declares itself above the very law it claims to enforce. The ICC appears, or perhaps the prosecutor, appears to be willing to trade the ICC's independence in return to access for coercive American force, what I think will prove to be a Faustian bargain that will be made at the price of the court's legitimacy and impartiality. But the price paid by the ICC will be trivial compared to the very dangerous consequences that this alliance could have for peace in Africa. I think that if the US convinces the ICC to pursue certain cases and disregard others by providing military enforcement capacity, ICC arrest warrants could end up providing justification for the direct use of US military force in the name of capturing war criminals, which is what we might see as part of the pursuit of LRA. It could also justify increased militarization of US allies in Africa in the name of building their capacity to enforce international justice. It could also allow the US and US allies to use violence with impunity, as that violence is sanctified as being in the name of international law enforcement. I fear that this highly partial, politicized prosecution could, instead of ending impunity, expand and entrench impunity in the name of enforcing international law. I also think that even the proposal of this alliance deeply threatens the credibility of the ICC, as the chief prosecutor's pandering to the US military is an affront to all of those around the world struggling to hold the US military accountable or who have suffered at its hands. The ICC also cannot avoid accommodating itself to political power on the local level, in particular in cases of state self-referrals, in which the ICC depends upon the referring state to assist in investigations and prosecutions. In the Uganda case, for example, the ICC has enjoyed a close working relationship with the Ugandan political and military authorities. For example, ICC investigators have been accompanied by UPDF officers, that is Ugandan military officers, when carrying out interviews with potential witnesses and victims. The current review conference, last Sunday's football match, and so on are all further testament to the ICC's close relationship with the Ugandan government. In exchange for this cooperation, it appears that the ICC has guaranteed that no members of the Ugandan government will be prosecuted by the ICC. Instead, the ICC has left the prosecution of government crimes to the Ugandan government itself. This accommodation to Ugandan government interests simply does not make sense to many people in northern Uganda if the talk radio shows and consultations and human rights reports are anything to go by. Why, people ask, should the ICC not hold the government equally accountable for war crimes, including the long-term mass forced displacement and internment of over 1 million people in squalid internment camps? Many Ugandans don't share the ICC's faith in the Ugandan government's capacity to impartially prosecute itself. And so it appears that the ICC has granted the Ugandan government impunity for its violence in northern Uganda. This appears to many to be a clear example of double standards, whereby international mechanisms are used to deal with the government's enemies, while the government is allowed to prosecute and absolve itself. Once again, this accommodation to political power in Uganda and elsewhere cannot but threaten the ICC's credibility. When confronted with this apparent selectivity and politicization, whether its refusal to prosecute US allies or its cooperation with certain African governments, the ICC tends to respond by declaring that global justice is evolutionary, that we shouldn't expect it to be perfect yet, but that someday its work will truly be universal. As Mr. Pace, the head of the CICC, declared, our grandchildren are the ones who will see the ICC universal. We are asked to have faith that one day we will all be redeemed by the ICC. This is a faith that many of us find hard to share. Second, the politics of peace. As we've heard, critics have argued that ICC interventions undermine peace. The response, heard frequently at this conference from NGOs, from the former and previous Secretary General, from a number of states delegates, is that there is, quote, no peace without justice, where justice is often assumed, or is assumed to be fulfilled through ICC interventions. But what does this claim mean? Is it a factual claim or a moral claim? That is, does it mean that there can be no peace without justice? Or is it saying that there should be no peace without justice? I think we need to consider both options. If it is a factual claim that there can be no peace without justice, then yes, absolutely, it is true that criminal justice procedures have helped bring about peace, and the failure to hold violent actors criminally accountable has undermined sustainable peace. It is true that ICC interventions can, in certain cases, help bring about sustainable peace. Absolutely.